Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. We've got a massive one today, taking a comprehensive journey through 250 years of American history. I mean, think about it. Going from a scrappy little cluster of rebellious colonies to a global superpower that literally reshaped the modern world. It's a story of relentless ambition and, as we'll see, constant contradiction. It's a huge, complex tale, but we're going to break it all down to really understand how we got from those original 13 colonies to where we stand today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our historical roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. The birth of the Republic. 2. Expansion and deep divides. 3. Industrial boom and empire. 4. The world at war. 5. The Cold War and civil rights. And we'll wrap things up with 6. The modern American era. Let's get right into it.
Now, before we even look at a timeline, we really have to look at the foundation. Written way back in 1776 by Thomas Jefferson, these words are basically the DNA of the American experiment. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It's an incredibly powerful founding ideal, but it also perfectly sets up the central tension that echoes through the entirety of this explainer. And honestly, the difference between these concepts perfectly illustrates that exact tension. On one hand, you have the profound ideals the nation was founded upon, liberty, democracy, and equality. But on the other, you have the harsh reality. This was a nation founded on freedom that simultaneously built its massive economy on the forced labor of enslaved Africans and expanded rapidly through the often violent displacement of Native American nations. You really can't understand American history without wrestling with both sides of this equation. All right, Section 1, Birth of the Republic. Rebellion and the Constitution. So how exactly did a disconnected cluster of 13 colonies decide to just take on the British Empire? I mean, that was the most powerful empire on Earth at the time, and it was all over suffocating trade restrictions and punishing taxes. Well, it happened fast. 1776 brings the Declaration of Independence, which sparks a brutal Revolutionary War. George Washington's half-starved Continental Army endured freezing winters and crushing defeats, but they finally trapped the British at Yorktown in 1781, forcing their surrender. But winning the war was just the first step. By 1787, they faced the immense, completely unprecedented challenge of actually building a functioning government from scratch, culminating in Washington taking office as the first president in 1789. To actually make that new government work, leaders like James Madison drafted the U.S. Constitution. It created a much stronger federal government, carefully divided power into 3 distinct branches to avoid tyranny and balanced representation through a bicameral Congress. They also threw in the Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties, but notice the compromise baked right into the foundation. In order to unite the northern and southern states, the framers legally enshrined the institution of slavery, politely referring to enslaved people as persons held to service or labor. They essentially planted a ticking time bomb directly into the foundation of the new republic. Let's move to Section 2, Expansion and Deep Divides, Manifest Destiny and the Crucible of Civil War. With a new government firmly in place, the young republic starts looking west, right? And this ignites massive territorial growth, but also, ultimately, devastating conflict. In 1803, President Jefferson literally doubles the size of the country overnight with the Louisiana Purchase. But this westward rush had a catastrophic human cost, leading to the tragic forced displacement of native nations, like the brutal Trail of Tears in the 1830s. Plus, every single new territory added forced a bitter, completely irreconcilable debate over whether that land would allow slavery. That deep divide finally snapped in 1861, plunging the whole nation into the Civil War. 4 million. To put that into perspective, that was the staggering population of enslaved Black Americans by 1870. Slavery wasn't just some localized Southern issue, it was the economic engine of the entire country. Enslaved labor fueled the vast Southern cotton plantations, which in turn fed the booming Northern textile mills. The entire American economy was just deeply entangled in this brutal system. Which brings us to the 2 sides of the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history. The Union was heavily industrialized, gaining a lot of abolitionist momentum and fighting to preserve the nation under President Abraham Lincoln. The Confederacy, on the flip side, was an agrarian economy reliant on wealthy slaveholders fighting for secession to protect the institution of slavery. This brutal war raged until 1865. The Union's victory led to the 13th Amendment, finally abolishing slavery, but that triumph was almost immediately shattered by the chaos of Lincoln's assassination just days later.
Moving right along to Section 3, Industrial Boom and Empire. The Gilded Age.
So after the trauma of the Civil War, the reunited country just hurtles into this astonishing period of rapid technological growth, massive wealth accumulation, and some really severe social inequality. By 1869, transcontinental railroads are suddenly connecting the coasts. Titans of industry are building massive empires in steel, oil, and finance. However, while the North and West are industrializing at breakneck speed, the post-war South simultaneously establishes Jim Crow, a brutal, legally enforced racial caste system that stripped away the rights of newly freed Black Americans. Now, what's really interesting here is how throughout all of this rapid growth, the concept of manifest destiny kept driving the nation forward. This was the belief that American expansion was both justified and completely inevitable. But that mindset didn't just stop at the Pacific coast. By the end of the century, right after the Spanish-American War, America began acting like a true empire, pushing overseas to seize territories like the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, and extending its influence heavily into Central America. This is the era that fundamentally laid the groundwork for America's role as the global power we recognize today.
Section 4. The World at War. Economic Collapse and Global Conflict.
Talk about a dramatic whiplash. That rising global power sets the stage for a wild roller coaster of unimaginable wealth, total economic collapse, and 2 global wars. The U.S. enters World War I in 1917, tips the balance, and proves itself a global heavyweight. This victory kicks off the roaring 1920s, an absolute explosion of jazz, consumerism, and credit. But it all comes crashing down with the Wall Street crash of 1929, leading straight into the crushing poverty of the Great Depression. And honestly, it isn't until the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 that the massive industrial mobilization for World War II finally pulls the economy out of the dirt, ending with the devastating drop of atomic bombs in 1945. 420,000. That is the tragic number of American lives lost in World War II. It was an absolutely massive sacrifice. But when the dust finally settled, the global landscape had changed forever. The old European empires were essentially bankrupt and broken. The United States emerged from the ashes not just intact, but as an economic juggernaut, a global creditor, and the world's very first nuclear-armed superpower. That brings us to Section 5, Cold War and Civil Rights. Boom, paranoia and protest. We're now in the post-war era. It's this dazzling time of suburban prosperity, rock and roll, and television. But all of it is overshadowed by the terrifying, constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The United States found itself in a fierce, decades-long standoff against the communist Soviet Union. This intense fear of communism spreading led to devastating proxy wars, first in Korea in the 1950s and later in Vietnam. But while the government was focused on containing the Soviets abroad, a massive, long-overdue cultural revolution was exploding at home, culminating in the passing of the landmark Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the stunning technological triumph of the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969. So the crucial point to take away from this is the profound duality of the era. On the global stage, you have the nuclear arms race, CIA-covered operations, and the space race. But domestically, the country is wrestling with deep, deep internal fractures. You have the heroic civil rights movement fighting to end segregation, massive counterculture protests against the Vietnam War, and the profound trauma of political assassinations, including JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. Think about it. A nation capable of putting a human on the moon was simultaneously tearing itself apart at home. Finally, Section 6, the modern American era. Hegemony, technology, and polarization.
Out of all that 20th century turmoil, we finally arrive at the 21st century. America stands as the sole global superpower, but faces a really complex series of modern shocks that have seriously tested its resilience. The 1990s began with the collapse of the Soviet Union, kicking off an era of optimism and a massive dot-com tech boom. But that optimism was completely shattered by the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001, shifting the nation into an era heavily defined by security fears. This was quickly followed by the severe economic anxiety of the 2008 global financial crash, and more recently, the profound societal disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Following 9/11, the U.S. launched the War on Terror, which included very long conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. $8 trillion. That's the staggering estimated cost of those 2 decades of conflict. As these wars dragged on with shifting objectives and immense human costs, the source material notes that it fueled a deep, lasting public skepticism toward government and political establishments, which really laid the groundwork for the political climate we see today. And that brings us to the present day, what the sources call the modern crucible, We see incredible technological conveniences existing right alongside some really serious challenges. The loss of manufacturing jobs has led to rapid deindustrialization in certain regions and rising wealth inequality. The digital revolution and artificial intelligence are completely changing how we work and live. Meanwhile, algorithmic social media is driving intense political polarization, essentially rewarding outrage over nuance. And overall, polls are consistently showing a deeply falling trust in government and traditional institutions across the board. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly important question. After 250 years of constant upheaval, ambition, crisis, and reinvention, what will the next chapter of the American experiment look like? As we've seen, the past was never simple, and it was definitely never perfect. But throughout all the contradictions and conflicts we've explored today, the defining attribute of the American spirit has always been its resilience, its drive for innovation, and the enduring, relentless pursuit of a better tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.